When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: The Black Pyramid. User: John Doe 12. Posted March 1st, 1998.
On January 26, 1950, a C-54 Skymaster, part of the 1st Strategic Air Support Squadron out of Briggs Air Force Base, left Anchorage, Alaska at 1 p.m. local time. 2 hours after departure, the flight, which carried an 8-man crew and 36 passengers, checked in via radio while above Snag, Yukon, and was supposed to do so again after Aisha-Ik. It was never heard from again. On October 16, 1972, a Cessna 310 carrying House Majority Leader Hale Boggs, Alaska Representative Nick Begich, Begich's aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns also went missing between Anchorage and Juneau. The Cessna's disappearance touched off one of America's biggest search and rescue missions, with 50 civilian planes and 40 military craft exhaustively combing an area the size of Maine for more than a month. Neither the plane nor the men it was transporting were ever located. These two incidents are just a small sampling of the people who've gone missing in Alaska since records first started being kept. Mainstream experts argue that Alaska, being wilder and less densely populated than the lower 48, is the reason so many people vanish in the state. While I believe this theory bears out in a large number of cases, I have another. Have you heard of the Transglobe Expedition? From 1979 to 1982, a party of explorers led by Sir Ranulph Fiennes circumnavigated the globe using only surface travel, enduring some of the harshest possible physical conditions. My Uncle Scott was a member of that party, an adventurer in the truest sense of the word. When I was a boy, we would spend weeks together at my grandfather's cabin, where he taught me everything I know about staying alive in environments which are actively trying to kill you. He understood wilderness survival on an instinctual level, and so when I say he went missing while searching for something in Alaska, something he'd been told he was better off not finding, you understand why I think there may have been foul play involved. When he wasn't driving dog sleds across Antarctic ice sheets, Scott was a field biologist. While on a consulting job outside of Anchorage in 1992, he saw a news report on local broadcast television that changed the course of his life. A story about the discovery of a buried megalith structure in Alaska. The report breathlessly described how underground nuclear tests in China's Taklamakan Desert had caused widespread seismic activity intense enough to register on U.S. Geological Survey instrumentation. While evaluating those readings, the USGS had noticed another anomaly somewhere in a triangular region between Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow in the north. According to the local newscaster, government dig teams were en route to unearth what appeared to be a man-made structure of record-breaking size. The report cut quickly to commercial and was never addressed again after the break. Scott's imagination ran wild. Though he wasn't an archaeologist, the possibilities represented by the report appealed to the adventurer in him, and once his contract was wrapped, he started making inquiries, starting with the station that had broadcast the report. Things got weird immediately. Everyone involved with the news program denied such a segment had ever aired. Not one to give up, he kept calling back until they finally just started hanging up on him when they heard his voice. Next came a visit from Anchorage PD, politely suggesting he move on to his next job before his welcome in Alaska was officially worn out. The officer actually waited for my uncle to pack and drove him to the airport where a ticket home was waiting. Scott was persistent, not stupid. He got on the flight and went back to Portland to regroup. From there, he began working connections he'd made through Transglobe. He quickly gathered that the news hadn't made it outside of regional outlets because, at first, no one seemed to know what he was talking about. After 2 months of working the phone, he finally struck gold. A friend of one of the expedition's money men put him in touch with a contact at the USGS. The woman, who would only speak under the condition of total anonymity, claimed she knew 2 things: that the object was located in Denali National Park and that before her department had been cut out of the loop, she'd seen memos describing a black pyramid 4 times bigger than the one at Giza. After that, government men she'd never seen before came through the office and removed all records of the discovery. My uncle was a sweet talker and convinced her to discreetly look for any paperwork on the pyramid the men might have missed. A week later, both her and the money man were dead in their homes, the alleged victims of carbon monoxide leaks. Scott felt an enormous amount of guilt for what had happened, and when he began receiving hang-up phone calls in the middle of the night, knew they were coming for him next. This is where I entered the picture with what I thought was a chance late-night encounter at Banning's in Tigard, where I like to write when the walls of my house feel like they're closing in. I knew something was wrong the minute he sat down at my table. Usually Scott was a big presence in any room, not rude, but expressive and often loud. That night was completely different. He was quiet, reserved, his shoulders hunched with tension. While we talked, his head was on a swivel, constantly looking for something or someone. He told me he was taking a trip and that if anyone had to come looking for him, I shouldn't hold anything back. Tell him exactly where and when this conversation had taken place and everything he said. He was emphatic about that if asked, I shouldn't change a single word. Then Scott told me he'd always been proud of me and that the time we'd spent together at his cabin when I was a boy was among his most treasured memories. Shortly after that, he was gone, and I sat there, my coffee going cold, wondering if he'd intentionally mistaken his own burned-out cabin on Opal Creek for Grandpa's on Mount Hood, where we'd actually stayed. 3 days later, men in suits came to my front door. They were tall, polite, and impeccably put together, their white teeth practically gleaming. As Scott predicted, they asked if I'd seen him recently. The impression I got was that they knew the answer already, so I did as instructed and told them everything, getting brisk nods in return. When it came to the cabin, they quoted the Opal Creek address where it had been before being leveled by a forest fire. Grandpa's cabin was never mentioned at all. I confirmed the address and their questions answered. The men left, not once telling me why they were so eager to find my uncle. I gave it a week. Scott's lessons on how to navigate the wilderness hadn't included anything about sniffing out a tail, and if my suspicions were correct, I didn't want to lead the men to whatever it left for me. Just in case, I found a listing in the phone book for rental cabins up on the mountain and booked one for a week. This way, anyone who might be listening in on my phone would hear the eccentric wilderness survival author booking himself a cabin where he could write for a few days. Nothing unusual about that. No one seemed to be following me on the 2-hour drive from my house to Mount Hood, and yet I still waited in the cabin a night and 2 days, banging out a few pages of my next novel before leaving under cover of darkness. 12 hours later, I arrived at my grandpa's cabin, exhausted, my legs aching. Scott taught me a lot about the woods, but it had been a long time since I'd actually used those skills, and I was feeling it. The cabin had only a single 100 by 100 square room, roughly divided into living, sleeping, and cooking areas by crude timber pony walls. I had intended to light a fire, get some rest, then search the place to see what, if anything, Scott had left behind, but opening the wood stove revealed a thick sheaf of papers bundled tight with twine. Instead of sleeping, I read everything by the light of the stove. It was all in his handwriting, page after page of notes, documenting his search for a black pyramid that may or may not exist. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've begun an investigation of my own, both into the pyramid and the fate of my uncle. Sadly, I'm all but convinced Scott is dead. Following his trail, I learned he left Portland the night after our conversation, ending up in the Alaskan town of Talkeetna days later. From there, he hired a charter plane to take him and a cache of trekking supplies to Carrie Lake in Denali National Park. His agreement with the pilot was for a pickup at the same spot in 4 months' time. When he didn't show at the appointed time, Scott joined the ranks of people search and rescue have been unable to find in what I've come to call the Alaskan Triangle. My research has led me to believe there is an active, ongoing plot to cover up the existence of an ancient megalith structure in the Triangle. The most ancient known archaeological site is Turkey's Göbekli Tepe, dating back to the year 9500 BCE. What little of it has been excavated thus far is nowhere near the complexity of the site our government has designated BEK 14. It's my belief that, if revealed, this black pyramid would completely upend our understanding of human history. That's why I'm preparing my own expedition to go find it, come what may. If I don't come back, you know where to look for me. This is your history, too. Don't let them get away with hiding it away from you.
Subject, New Year's Eve. User, WarX2K. Posted, January 4th, 2000.
Being completely surrounded by people isn't ever a good time. Being surrounded by people when you're in the company of someone who hates crowds is even worse. Throw in the fact that you told this person well in advance that they were going to hate the experience they were currently complaining about, and you start to wonder if maybe Cassandra hadn't minded being murdered by the Greeks. This is ridiculous. I can't see shit. I sighed. Yes, I know. This is why I told you we shouldn't bother coming. I figured you were just being a whiny bitch baby, like how you can be sometimes. I threw my hands up. I was already cold and annoyed. Why compound my misery by starting an argument I couldn't win? It was New Year's Eve, 1999. Emery and I were in New York's Times Square waiting for the ball to drop, surrounded by 100,000 other people who should have known better. In my limited experience, events like this, the Macy's Day Parade or any parade, frankly, are meant to be seen on TV from the comfort of a warm bar somewhere. Actually, being there in person is like living in your own personal Godzilla movie. Whatever's happening is bigger than you. Getting away is near to impossible, and your only hope is that the end comes quickly. Emery pushed his hands further into his jacket pockets. Two women, not more than 5 feet tall and looking as if they were being swallowed whole by their pink puffy coats, shrieked at a decibel level only slightly higher than a jet engine taking off. We both winced. Speaking of shit, it smells like it too. None of these fuckers shower before they leave the house. The end of a millennium, half of them reek like they struck it rich drilling for asshole. I snorted. That was a new one. I'd known Emery for 5 years, and he had yet to run out of highly detailed complaints about the world around him. We met in '94. I'd been in the Arizona desert, trying to hitch my way back up to a fruit-picking job in the Pacific Northwest when he offered me a lift. I didn't know what to make of him. Muscle car, green and yellow Hawaiian shirt, mirrored sunglasses. He wasn't tall or even overly muscular, but the way he carried himself reminded me of the JSOC guys I'd known in my other life. That relaxed confidence of someone who could do real damage when they felt it was necessary. The gun I found in his glove box just confirmed what I already knew. A road closure had forced us to overnight at some skeezy motel in the middle of nowhere, run by a gang of skinheads who weren't subtle about advertising their twin side hustles of drugs and women. Around 2 a.m, I woke up to one hell of a brawl between those skinheads and what turned out to be, well, a werewolf in a torn green and yellow Hawaiian shirt. The skinheads started shooting. They weren't differentiating between me and the big guy, so I returned fire with the pistol from his car. Just as they were about to retreat, their leader, a mountain-sized psychopath named Billy, who we'd crossed paths with while checking in, rammed a battleship-sized pickup truck into Emery. Big as he was, Billy was knocked out by the impact, giving me enough time to haul Emery's body, now back to human size, into his car. The psycho was waking up as we peeled out, and I'll never forget the look on his face, a mixture of embarrassment and rage you only ever see on big guys who aren't used to getting hit hard enough to feel it. That touched off a 2-day chase through the desert, where I learned the world was a hell of a lot more complicated than even I'd given it credit for. Emery healed fast, but still wasn't at full strength by the time Billy and the rest of his assholes had caught up with us. The whole thing ended in another brawl. This one an ugly fight to the death between the juiced-up skinhead and my new friend as a half-built shopping mall burned down around them. When it was over, Billy's neck was broken, and I was again loading Emery, battered and bloody, into the passenger seat of his car. We've been on the road together ever since. I'm just spitballing here, Emery, but maybe a crowd of 200,000 people is the wrong place for a werewolf's tender sense of smell. He glared at me, breath steaming out of his mouth. Don't call me that. I'm not a fucking werewolf. You can turn at will into a hulking, hairy, super powerful monster with a wolf's face. What else do you call that? I come from a place where people can turn into animals because we're connected to the land, and we understand there's not that much separating us from them. That's a beautiful, noble thing. What you guys call werewolves are like some kind of metaphor for herpes or some shit. You call me a werewolf, you're basically calling me someone's rotted dick. Okay, now he was cranky. A group of teenagers, their breath reeking of booze, pushed past us. It was 15 minutes to ball drop, and it seemed like everyone except us was drunk. Being here had been Emery's idea. In all of his surprisingly long life, he'd never bothered to celebrate a New Year. Since this was the New Year's Eve to end all New Year's Eves, he figured why not go big? Now, I could tell he just wanted to go, and I was all for it. Let's just get out of here, man. We can find a bar uptown that has 2 open stools and get hammered. His lower lip was pooched out, something he did unconsciously when he was having a sulk. Then he nodded reluctantly. I do like getting hammered, and this place... He gestured broadly at the assembled crowd and blaring music. Fucking sucks. I laughed, and that got a smile out of him. I gestured back toward the barricades we'd come through at the beginning of the night, and he nodded. We were halfway there, pushing aside frat boys wrapped in American flag regalia, when a booming sound like thunder turned up to 11 drowned out everything else. Emery and I both covered our ears as a second later the night was split by a bright green glow. We looked up to see a huge green fireball rocketing across the sky from west to east. A moment after it disappeared, I felt a wave of energy, like a bomb blast, move through me. I could tell by the look on his face that Emery had felt it too, and yet not a single other person in that crowd reacted. They kept jumping around and shouting as if nothing had happened at all. You saw that too, right? He nodded. Since we'd been traveling together, Emery had educated me on an entire other world living below the surface of this one. Werewolves, or whatever he was, were just the tip of a very strange iceberg. Now, before I deemed anything to be truly inexplicable, it first had to baffle him too, so I had to ask, have you ever seen anything like that before? He shook his head. It was headed east, Doc. What's east from here? This had been my first visit to NYC since before I shipped out to Somalia in '92, so my mental map of the city, which had never been great in the first place, was now pretty spotty. I don't know, Astoria, Queens if you go further out? Well, he said, guess we're gonna be seeing more of this place than I'd planned. You wanna go find it? Whatever it was? He gave me a look, the one he always had when he was telling me we had to do something that seemed dangerous or stupid or both. In a crowd of a million assholes, we're the only ones who see and feel what amounts to a bomb going off. You think that's a coincidence? I sighed. Again, it was never a coincidence. The bar stools were gonna have to wait. The year 2000 was here with a bang, and someone had to figure out what it wanted. All right, I said, let's go.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, Visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.